Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're taking on a truly fascinating and maybe, at times, pretty unsettling stack of sources, stuff that really challenges some widely held beliefs.
That's right.
Our mission, like always, is to cut through the noise, look at these, well, often provocative views, and pull out the most important bits of knowledge and insight for you.
Indeed. We'll be looking at articles, some research analyses, all delving deep into, the shifting global landscape. They scrutinize societal control mechanisms, and they re-examine narratives around science and health.
Yeah.
These sources, taken together, they offer a perspective that really encourages us to look beyond the usual headlines, question the deeper stuff.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The material we've got paints a picture of, well, pretty significant shifts. Power, technology, even our basic understanding of social norms. Get ready for some real eye-openers because this deep dive is designed to get you the info quickly, thoroughly, but without feeling, overwhelmed. We're just presenting the ideas from the sources so you can weigh them yourself.
Geopolitical shifts and the quest for sovereignty.
So we're starting big picture. A world, these sources say, is in flux. A reordering of global power.
Right.
What really jumps out is how they talk about tectonic plates of power shifting. They actually call it the twilight of Western dominion. What do they mean by that exactly? What's driving this, according to them?
Well, the sources argue this twilight is about a perceived decline, really, in the singular dominance of the U.S. and its Western allies.
Yeah.
The situation since the Cold War ended.
Okay.
They point to the rise of other power blocs, specifically alliances like BRICS, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa.
Great, BRICS.
And according to this material, these nations are actively trying to, and I quote, reverse, undo, and roll back the whole colonial expansion.
Yeah.
They see that as defining the global order for centuries. So it's fundamental.
Not just diplomacy, but a real rebalancing act. And a key part of this, as these sources see it, is this move towards de-dollarization.
Yes, that comes up a lot.
They claim countries like Saudi Arabia are rethinking their reliance on the U.S. dollar, apparently because they're worried about the U.S. seizing foreign reserves. Is that the main reason?
Okay, the context they give. They claim actions like freezing Russian reserves after the Ukraine invasion sent shockwaves.
I can imagine.
So they suggest this pushed nations, especially those holding lots of dollars, to look for alternatives. Other reserve currencies, maybe independent financial systems, it's presented as not just economic, but strategic.
A way to protect their sovereignty, their financial independence, from what they see as the dollar being used as a weapon.
Exactly. That's the argument in these sources.
Now, speaking of global conflicts, Ukraine comes up. And the view here is stark, very critical.
It is.
It's framed in these documents as a, quote, vicious all-out confrontation between U.S.-led NATO and Russia, with Ukraine caught in the middle, the battleground. But they go further. They allege the U.S. and NATO are prolonging an unwinnable war, hurting Ukraine. And then this really provocative bit. They claim it enables a neo-colonial privatization of an entire country. They name BlackRock, J.P. Morgan. That's huge. How do they explain that privatization?
It is a very strong claim. The sources allege that as Ukraine's economy suffers from the war, these international financial players are moving in, positioning themselves to acquire Ukrainian assets, farmland, infrastructure, state companies often, they say, at bargain prices.
Oh, through aid packages.
They suggest it's facilitated by loans and aid tied to certain economic reforms. This, the sources argue, creates dependency. It effectively transfers national wealth, national control to foreign entities. They explicitly liken it to modern colonialism.
Wow.
This neo-colonial privatization, as they call it, is presented as a kind of underlying economic driver for the conflict continuing.
That's a really disturbing angle from these sources. So it raises the question, what do they say is really driving these conflicts? Not just Ukraine, but say the Middle East.
Consistently, the sources contend it's about strategic aims, economic objectives, often benefiting powerful interests.
For instance?
Well, regarding the Middle East, the U.S.-Israel relationship is called a war racket in one source, benefiting arms makers specifically.
A war racket?
Yes. And the material describes Israel's actions in Gaza as a genocidal policy of retribution against civilians. They state the goal is ethnic cleansing to achieve a greater Israel.
And they connect this to history.
They do. They cite historical figures like Theodore Herzl, back in 1895, his vision for a Jewish state, and they reference Plan Dalet from 1948, which these sources describe as a blueprint that involved displacing Arab populations.
And they don't stop there. They also point fingers at lobbying groups like AIPAC.
Right, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee.
Yeah.
The claim in the material is that groups like AIPAC push for unconditional military aid to Israel and push for sanctions on Iran.
Which, the sources worry, could drag the U.S. into a wider war.
That's the concern they express, yes. A broader regional conflict.
Yeah. Societal control, information, and challenging norms.
Okay, so we've touched on these big international power plays. Now let's bring it closer to home. Societal control, individual liberty. This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Mm-hmm.
There's a strong theme in these documents about government overreach. Surveillance especially. We saw claims about the FBI asking Google for identities of YouTube viewers. Tens of thousands.
Yes, that report was cited. And similar requests for IP addresses, even for people without Google accounts watching certain videos.
So what are the bigger implications they draw from this kind of thing?
Well, the sources call it a digital dragnet. They argue it's unconstitutional, violates the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and the Fourth Amendment protection from unreasonable searches.
Right.
And they tie this into worries about FISA Section 702 powers being expanded.
Okay, remind us, Section 702 is?
It's U.S. law, originally for surveilling non-U.S. persons abroad for foreign intelligence. But these sources argue its use has ballooned. They claim it now enables warrantless spying on U.S. citizens, including activists, protesters, because their communications get incidentally swept up.
Then the scope widens again. They talk about global elite agendas. The World Economic Forum, the WEF, comes up a lot.
Frequently, yes.
As pushing a fourth industrial revolution.
Yeah.
What do the sources say that is, and what are its alleged consequences?
They portray it as this massive push to digitize absolutely everything in our lives.
Everything.
That's the picture painted. Including, they claim, developing tech to monitor thoughts and emotions by AI to combat climate change, which sounds incredibly intrusive.
Yeah, to say the least.
And beyond that, they claim this revolution means replacing human jobs with robots, with AI, leading to mass unemployment, a totally restructured society where human work isn't really needed.
And the WEF is also accused in some of these sources of orchestrating the U.S. border situation, calling it replacement migration aimed at collapsing the U.S. economy. That seems extreme. How do they connect those dots?
It is a very bold claim. These sources allege the migration isn't just happening, but it's engineered.
Engineered why?
For a dual purpose, they claim. First, destabilize society, strain resources. Second, create a large dependent population to undermine the current economy, ultimately aiming to, quote, collapse the U.S. economy and usher in some new globally run system.
Wow. Okay, connecting this more broadly. The UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Its goals are called a scam in this material.
Yes, described as promoting sustainability as collectivism and artificial scarcity.
What do they mean by sustainability as collectivism?
The interpretation in these sources is that environmental or social goals are used as a cover for centralizing power, moving decisions away from individuals, from nations, towards global bodies.
And this restricts freedom. Property rights.
That's the argument, that it leads to policies restricting individual liberty and property in the name of the collective good, often benefiting specific corporations via public-private partnerships.
Which they call?
Crony capitalism and artificial scarcity, they claim, is about deliberately restricting resources or making them unaffordable, even if they're plentiful, to enforce compliance and control people.
Then there's this concept of the Great Taking. What's that about?
That posits a plan by global elites to seize private property, particularly securities like stocks and bonds, by using future economic crises or system failures as a trigger, basically fundamentally changing who owns what.
Okay, and it gets even more provocative. The sources talk about social engineering, even mind control.
Yes.
They suggest think tanks are shaping social norms, with an alleged end goal to install a sexless, genderless society and even, quote, turning people gay. These are extraordinary claims. What basis do they offer?
They point to things like the Richard Day tapes from 1969, purported recordings outlining future social changes, and the Jaffa memo, supposedly from the 70s, about population control.
So, alleged historical documents outlining a plan.
That's what the sources claim these documents show. A long-term strategy to alter family structures, gender, sexuality. And they go further. How?
They allege it's made worse by environmental chemicals. They specifically name atrazine, the herbicide, and BPA from plastics. Both are known endocrine disruptors.
And the link they make is
that these chemicals directly mess with human hormones, contributing to these societal shifts, interfering with natural development.
Which brings us to information itself. The WEF declared misinformation and disinformation the world's greatest threat.
How do these sources see that declaration?
They interpret it purely as a justification for censorship and speech controls.
A pretext, basically.
Exactly. They argue that labeling dissent as misinformation lets powerful groups control the narrative, shut down other views. They use COVID-19 as a major example.
How so?
Describing the pandemic response as a digital coup d'etat, a cover story they claim for a great reset, more centralized power, censorship, surveillance.
And specific examples they cite.
They mention the alleged suppression of the lab leak theory about the virus's origin, and also harsh criticism of mask mandates. Both, they contend, were shut down or dismissed by experts who stuck to the official line.
Re-examining science and health narratives.
Okay, moving finally to science and health. Here, the sources offer a really skeptical take on some mainstream ideas. Climate change, for instance. They bring up the controversy around Professor Michael Mann and his hockey stick graph. That graph was huge, showing the sharp temperature rise.
Very influential, yes. But these sources focus on the controversies.
Such as?
They highlight accusations that Mann was held in contempt of court for not handing over data in a libel case, and allegations he deliberately manipulated data to get that hockey stick shape.
So they present it as an example of potentially flawed or manipulated science driving the consensus.
That's the argument, yes. And what's interesting is how they contrast this with the study they cite by Chinese scientists.
What did that study find, according to these sources?
It claimed that islands supposedly doomed to disappear under rising sea levels have actually grown in size.
Grown? How do the sources use that finding?
They say it blows holes in accepted climate narratives about sea levels and sinking islands. Presents it as evidence that maybe some predictions are overblown or incorrect.
And they link this to policy concerns.
They do. They mention the idea of carbon passports to ration travel based on your carbon footprint.
Carbon passports.
Yeah, they present it as an extreme, worrying future possibility. An example, they suggest, of how climate issues could be used for really tight control over people's lives.
Then there's COVID-19 again. The sources make some really unsettling claims here. They point to a confidentiality agreement from November 2019.
Yes.
Showing Moderna allegedly shipped COVID mRNA vaccine prototype to scientists weeks before COVID-19 allegedly hit the world. What's the implication they draw from that timing? November 2019.
They see it as highly suspicious.
Yeah.
It suggests to them that the vaccine development was already happening. Maybe the virus was known before it officially emerged.
So the implication is pre-knowledge or something more.
The implication within these documents leans towards the idea that the pandemic was perhaps foreseen, or maybe even they hint, manufactured, which then allowed for a very fast rollout of a vaccine that was already in the works, benefiting certain companies and pushing certain agendas.
That is a truly remarkable claim from these sources. And related to the vaccines, what about how they're classified? Gene therapy.
Right. The sources state that BioNTech and Moderna are reportedly lobbying in Europe against having their mRNA injections classified as gene therapy.
Even though some sources claim they act like gene therapy.
That's the counter-argument presented in the material.
Yeah.
That their mode of action fits the definition. The sources then allege the NIH, the National Institutes of Health in the U.S., abruptly stopped investigating and communicating with victims of COVID vaccine damage right when the pandemic was peaking.
Suggesting a cover-up of adverse events.
Suggesting a deliberate suppression of information, yes. And just to tie back to the earlier point about chemicals, one source even includes an anecdote of an individual claiming they felt less gay after taking a supplement to remove glyphosate, the herbicide.
Directly linking chemical toxicity to sexual confusion.
That's the explicit link made in that particular account within the sources. Outro.
So, where does all this leave us? This deep dive looking through these specific sources, it paints a picture, doesn't it? A world where, according to them, old power structures are shifting, technology is potentially a tool for control, and established narratives in science, health, society are facing some fierce challenges.
It absolutely does. The material we've gone through today, it really prompts critical thinking about the information we all get. It pushes you to consider other perspectives, maybe be more vigilant about the forces these sources claim are shaping things.
Yeah.
It's really about helping you navigate the different layers of information out there.
Definitely gives you a lot to chew on. So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought, maybe a provocative one. based on what we've discussed. In an age where information is everywhere, but discernment, as these sources strongly imply, might be actively discouraged or even suppressed, how do you make sure you're not just informed, but truly well-informed, especially when you encounter narratives that shake the very foundations of what you thought you knew?